sky space. Kind of emit these dancing spiders. If we bring them up here to these lights here, the green light. I think this is the green light. We've got a red light here. Wait, this is the green light. No? It's a regular light. They emit into a larger bundle. The faster I move this object around, so I get this kind of velocity trail of these pulsing spiders, and you can kind of make these crazy dragon looking shapes. I decided I wanted to do just one more little video here for 30 Days of Symmetry. So I thought this one was just kind of pretty, and it's actually extremely easy to set up, and I want other people to know how to set this up because I think there's a lot of really cool visuals that are achievable really easily, and it'd be great to have other people experimenting with some of the parameters here. And some of the stuff we've been doing, especially in the last few days, changing things, changing the pitch or changing a color based on velocity. Here I'm changing the scale of the group of little animations that's in here. You can also change the time scale, so the speed at which these things were to rotate and whatnot. Maybe I'll also create this sky space with you, because I think this is kind of a cool liminal space to experience. So let's dissect this, and then we'll learn how to do it. This should be a fairly easy course. It's in fact at its bare minimum, there would be no lines of code. The only line of code just changes the scale of these animation units based on the speed of the movement, and so you could accomplish this with no code, or add even more code from other lessons that you've learned. So if you take a look at these any one of these units, it's actually, when it compounds, it ends up being kind of a nice visual pattern and visual kind of spectacle, but at the base of it, all you really have is this simple singular piece. Not even, there's just 8 repeated kind of copies of the same underlying unit, and that's exactly all it is. Is this little, each one of these arms is a unit with a timeline, and so there's 8 of them copied into a group, and then that group is stuck under a spinner, and the spinner is just another little node with a rotation signal on it, and then you're just emitting those from an emitter that gets carried by this grip tool under Alive Tools. So all you need to do to build this or anything like this is your underlying unit that you're stacking together, and there you go. And obviously you can get the thing, maybe it's not obvious, so you can see that I'm actually able to create kind of rotation, and that's another attribute of the emitter, is that it will emit rotationally. So it preserves the rotation. So if I spin this as I go, that rotation gets translated to the underlying object that gets emitted. The other thing is, you'll see that there's a kind of a wave of the openings, and the timeline starts at 0 when the item is emitted. So it takes this rotation. It also starts its timeline at the moment that it gets emitted. So we're going to make this animation such that when we animate, when each one starts, and it loops continuously. When it starts, it'll go into an open and then a closed sequence, then a loop, and then that means that these things will kind of as you lay them out in the line, they'll end up in a little sequence, kind of in a wave of that action. And this one's kind of cool because you get all of these different angles, and that wave effect then kind of cascades the light. So we've added some specularity to this material so that it reflects, and it'll bounce a lot of that light and change based on the rotational aspect that the light's hitting it at. So you get a lot of interesting kind of light, almost like a signal of energy kind of going down this larger apparatus. So you could build up from this and build, build a lot of different items. So this item that I have here, this is a grip for a light, but this little handle that's kind of controlling these emissions. You could have a bunch of these, and you could toggle through them. And these also doesn't have to be sitting out there in the space. This could be, coming out. We can emit these as we press a button on our controller and shoot these out into the air and have them kind of spinning around. This is kind of just the basics for how to set up something like this. I think it's a kind of a beautiful thing it's the kind of thing that you can set up and put a friend in it or take to a party, and if you had a handful of these different emitted animations, people will play in this thing for a long time, and they'll mess around with the light and bring the light into different positions. And I also think it's the kind of thing that is a good setup for also having kind of projections out. If you were to have a camera, looking in at different locations, it's a great setup, I think, for feeding into a VJ set as well. Get a dancer to kind of put interesting animations into space here. Okay, let's learn how to do it. So what we have is actually a terrain space where I've made this sky space. I've made the terrain itself disappear by making the terrain invisible. We can just take a look at kind of the look of the world as I did it. Have made it up here. Got a late afternoon in the middle of summer, a pretty high latitude or moderate latitude, medium elevation. I cranked up the intensity of the stars so you could see the stars, and then I enabled custom colors and tinkered with Rayleigh and me. By bringing Rayleigh down, you pretty much cut out kind of that orange diffusion. You get this light blue. Me is overall just sort of like kind of a diffusion factor in a way. It's kind of more of a light scatterer. And then you can kind of tinker with the amount of diffusion. Anyway, I got to a place that I enjoyed it. So it had this light blue, and then yeah, and I've got clouds at pretty high density, low coverage, and I didn't really have much wind going, but could. Okay, so what we have here is I've got a regular preset VR rig in here that's grabbing a grip. This is under the live tools. You can add it after the fact, and it'll grab a camera, it'll grab a light, it'll hold on to and kind of contain a light, a camera, and an emitter, so that you can kind of grab and position those items dynamically. You saw me moving those lights around, and also this grip. So what's under this grip is a node emitter that, as it emits, it makes some scalar value that we call amount, and it says, okay, I'm going to make an amount value, and this is the on emit. Right as I'm emitting, as this node emitter emits, it's gonna go and basically query its parent, the rigid body of its parent, the physics attribute. It's going to get the linear velocity, and it's going to get the overall magnitude of that. So that's the speed of this. So as I move this really quickly, it gets that. And then it also just divides it by 10 or multiplies by 0.1, just to kind of knock this amount value down a little bit, but to at least base it on the variation of the velocity at which I move this thing through space. And then I'm setting the scale of the object. OBJ is the reference for the item that's getting emitted out of the emitter, which in our case is this whole object, this group of units that are animated. They're groups. It's a group of units and timelines. In fact, it's a node that spins containing a group that contains a unit and timelines that are basically identical replicas, just rotated into a pattern. So as the object gets emitted, its world scale gets set into a vector 3 that is amount in the x, amount in the y, amount in the z, and that amount again is coming from the velocity of moving the grip. And these are the two lines of code that make this entire thing possible, and that's basically entirely it. So let's set up a little let's set up a unit timeline to achieve this, and we'll build this here from scratch. Great. I will save as 2. Emitted animations. Call that 2. I'm gonna make a new one. Let's go ahead and just do a little bit of horizon work. Make a pretty place to work. Again, in our sky space. See if I can replicate this. Later in the day, middle of the year. Latitude's fine. Higher in the elevation, which kind of cuts down to a bluer value. I'm going to enable custom colors, knock down Rayleigh, increase the amount of me, increase the amount of diffusion, and add some clouds, make the coverage a little bit. Go back to the sky space. We're going to do stars, increase the intensity of the stars, and then what we're going to do, the main thing that makes the big difference is click on the terrain, and under terrain, expand terrain, expand materials on the default material. Just make the default material visible false, and that means you're no longer seeing the ground. It'll still be there for things to collide with it, but this is kind of a cool way to build. It does in fact now darken kind of our objects, but we're going to bring back lights. I think that's largely the diffusion. But we're going to bring back lights that'll end up shining onto the objects that we build to get dramatic light effects. And the other thing is that the objects that we're going to use are going to be kind of shiny and really reflect and really give us a lot of bang for our buck when they rotate in terms of shininess, and so that means adding specularity to the material. So we're going to create a new material for them by right-clicking in the library here, and we're going to do material, new standard material, and let's take a look at the diffuse color. We'll just start off with white, and then we're going to make the specularity pretty high. Let's actually just apply it to one of these objects to kind of see what we're working with. We'll apply it to both here, so standard objects, and standard material. I'll rotate this a little bit, just to sample like a different aspect. And let's go back to the standard material, clicking in the library to access the standard material. We'll move up the specularity a little bit more. That's going to be good. We'll play with it a little bit more later, but you see this little spot right here where we're getting that shimmer. So as things rotate across, and that's coming off of a reflection off of this light, and that's going to be good. We want that as we rotate, at least for this effect. You could look at and want a whole bunch of different types of effects, but that kind of sheen is what we're going to go for. So we can actually delete these objects, and now that we have this material, that we'll just call it shimmer material. And so now the main thing that we're going to do is set up a unit plus timeline, and we've had a couple of tutorials about this in the 30 days of Simmetri. But a new unit in timeline means that it's a unit which has a self-contained library, and it's got a timeline that comes packaged with it. So let's create one, and I'll tell a bit more about it. What you're going to do is come to the plus button, and you're going to go to new unit and timeline. You do a new unit, but you want to do a new unit and timeline. So just like our world has a timeline that's cruising around, our unit has a timeline that's constantly running. So our world, and when we enter a default terrain space or any space, it has a timeline specific to the space. The universe has a timeline. Each space, like the terrain space, has a timeline, and then any unit plus timeline has a specific timeline to it. And then last but not least, you can have many different timelines inside of your terrain space inside of your terrain space, and they can be all set at different time scales, and they can have different things animating on those properties. There's nothing limiting you to a particular amount of time. It's just that this unit comes with a very specific timeline that allows you to package up animations specific to that unit. So we open up the unit by double left clicking, which puts us into the unit space. And if I draw something in the unit space, like a box, it now has I'm now no longer first of all, it has this gray box around it, and I'm no longer able to click outside and grab and get a hold of things that are not in the unit. Right now there's a box in the unit, as you can see. If I clone something, it stays inside. I've got another box entity, and you can see that little gray box, which is that little gray outline, just saying, hey, you're in unit space right now. You're inside a unit. And I'm going to get rid of those. And if you want to get out of the unit space, you can either click this little up arrow, which says basically, hey, you want to go up and back to terrain space, and that'll take you out of the thing, and you say, now I'm editing the terrain space contents. If I double left click in the unit, I go back into the unit, and you'll say, now editing units contents. And so you can see that I've got this nice box here indicating for me that I'm in the unit. I'm seeing unit right here and nothing else that's in the space. I don't see the spotlight. I see this little arrow, so I know that I'm in the unit. And lastly, I'm selected on this unit. The other thing is that when I've double-clicked into a unit in timeline, the timeline that's open is my unit timeline. But just to make it easy for everyone, I'm going to go ahead and just call this the unit timeline. And so now you can see that there's a unit timeline that's open. If I go back to terrain space, it's the terrain space timeline that's open. If I go to the unit timeline, now I'm looking at the unit timeline because I've double clicked and I'm now in the unit. I can push this little plus button here, and that will pin the tab of the unit, which means that if I exit by double left clicking in the space somewhere outside of the thing or following the up arrow, I'm now out of the unit, but my unit timeline remains. If I press play, my terrain space timeline runs, and you can see that my unit timeline is also running. But for example, if I'm in the unit timeline and I want this unit timeline, the unit timeline's active property to be false, and then let's double click outside of our space. I'm in playtime, the terrain space timeline is running, but the unit timeline is not, right? And so I can get to the unit timeline through the hierarchy or by drilling down into the unit and getting the timeline there. But if I go into the hierarchy and I get the unit timeline, you can see that my terrain space is cruising along. We're now at 19 seconds since we hit play. I can click over to the unit timeline and see that it hasn't moved yet. And if I come over to unit timeline and gather its properties, the unit timeline properties, and is active as false, and I set it to true, now it's moving. And now this unit timeline is at 4 seconds while our terrain space timeline is at 36 seconds. And so there's a delay in it. So what that means is that, you know, our unit timeline is packaged with our unit, and when the unit gets created, its timeline starts at 0. I'll give you an example as well. So if I take this unit, if I'm in the terrain, I'm editing the terrain space right now, and if I want to take the unit and make a clone, if I look at the timeline, I'm at 16 seconds on the unit timeline, the terrain space timeline. If I double click into unit copy and take a look at the unit copy timeline, there's a gap, right? So 30 seconds, I'm at 34 seconds on the unit timeline, and on the unit's copy timeline, I'm at 26. So there's a 10-second gap there. And that was the 10 seconds it took me before I made this unit copy. So anyway, you get this idea of these relative timelines and their relative start points. So what we're going to do is create an animation in one unit timeline, and we're going to make copies in stop time. So all these units are going to start at once. Like each one of these units is going to be like an arm of it's going to be the arm of that kind of spider item. And then what we'll do is package those into a group. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to drill into the unit. So I'm going to double left click into the unit like so, and I get the box again. Hang on, let me go back to the terrain space. Terrain space timeline, I'll pin that as well. I go into the unit timeline. There we go. So what I'm going to do is basically make a long, thin rectangle, and then I'm going to kind of have a smaller one. I'm going to have like a long, a medium, and a small. So we're going to do a little sculpting here, a little construction. I'm going to start off by deleting this rectangle, and I'll make my own. I searched for something kind of almost finger-like, so I was searching for kind of this dimension. Maybe I'll make it a little less long, something like so. And these things, we're not going to have a rigid body because I kind of want them to float in the air, so I don't want any physics acting on them. So I'm actually going to remove that attribute. I can get rid of the trigger activating because we're not going to be messing around with triggers with this thing yet. So, oops, I double clicked out of it, so I'm now back in the world space. Let's double click back in, we're in the unit. I'm going to basically make a copy by holding down Alt and holding down Shift and sliding off a copy. And what I'm going to do is just scale this new object. I'm going to hit R and then just kind of scale it down a little bit. I could probably go by exact percentages, you know, some sort of like finger-like kind of golden ratio phi type of thing. In fact, let's take a look. If I go to transform and I look at its scale, I'm at about 6 something. I'll go 6.2. just for simple math. I'll go to 6.2, and then I'll do it again one more time, holding down Alt and Shift. And I'll make this one, well, let's take a look here because we are, well, yeah, sure. Let's do 0.62. Do point like 3.8. 0.39. Okay, so now I've got this this item, and what I want to do is get one to. They basically need to. This one needs to sort of follow this one, which needs to follow this one, and what that means is I'm going to set up a hierarchy for each one of these. So I'm actually going to first name them. I'm going to say call this one 3, call this one 2, call this one 1. And then 3 is going to be a child of 2. So I'm going to grab the number space of 3, make it a child of 2. Grab the number space of 2, make it a child of 1. And now what I want to do is figure out a way to achieve for this to rotate. But I want it, I don't like actually where it's rotating at. It's rotating, the pivot is in the center, so I want to make sure that the pivot is, I want the pivot to be like over here. Like I want this thing to basically like pivot around like a knuckle. So what I need to do is change the way that this thing is functioning. So I want to actually change where the pivot lives, and so what I can do after the fact here is actually go to a mesh modifier and add what's called a line pivot. And what this will do is it'll change to where the mesh is with where this pivot is with respect to this pivot. And so I can say, let's see what happens if I go X on the minimum. So I go X minimum, and all of a sudden I am in fact kind of right where I want to be. I think if I want to work off of that center, I should be in a good place now. So this could actually sit right here, and when I rotate over, I basically begin to hide the underlying item. So let's take a look. What's my rotation in that case? So that's a 180. That brings me over there, and what brings me, and let's bring that back out to 0, and then let's mess around with this other one. So this one, this number 3 object needs that same thing. So we'll go to mesh modifiers, and we'll go to a line pivot, and I think I went to minimum on the x-axis, and now I've got this item kind of right here. And so if I take the number 2, if I take the number 3 and rotate it, I think that was 180 on the Z, and then if I pack the number 2 will be at 180 on the Z. I've now effectively collapsed our arms, our fingers 2 and 3 inside of 1. Now what I need to do is animate 3 and 2. I should rechild 2 to 1 here. So now basically what I need to do is accomplish the equivalent of this, of 2 and 3 happening at the same time. So let me reset that. I think we want to be at 180. Okay, so now we need rotation keyframes on our unit timeline, which gets packaged with our unit. And so what we want to do is open up 2 needs a rotation, a Z rotation keyframe, so it needs this one keyframed. We could do other ones. We could put other transform keyframes in here. They could raise, they could slide out. This is where I think you can experiment with all kinds of really cool items. And additionally, those of you who've been following along and are pretty adept with Lua, you could make these animations take place through some of the tutorials we've talked about by animating through script, which I think would be also really interesting because you can kind of add different, you can kind of change the mathematics dynamically based on the state of the world at the point that you clone these into the world. But for now, what we're going to do is do them on a timeline. So what I need is the Z rotation of 2 and the Z rotation of 3. So let's make a Z rotation new key track. So that's going to be Z key track, and I'm going to number it. I'm going to call it Z2 key track. And I'm going to call this, I'm going to get the transform, I'm going to select number 3, come down to rotation to the Z new key track. Call that a Z3 key track. And now on 2, I'm going to go from some time frame, I'm going to say 2.5 seconds to open. And I'll just make I can like zoom in by the scroll wheel. I'll make it exactly 2 seconds. If you want, there's tools for snapping up at under view, edit view, snap to timeline, time snapping, and you can. So in 2 seconds, I want each of these to open. I'm going to use a smooth interpolation, so I'm right-clicking between these values. I'm going to click smooth. And right now we are at, if I hover over, you'll see, it's doing it in radians. But you'll see here, if I right-click it, you'll see it in degrees. So if I right-click, you'll see that I'm at 180. And since I just cloned this one off, or since I just created a default one, I'm at the current value, which is 180. If I want to be at 0 in 2 seconds, I need to right-click here, click 0, right-click here, hit 0, and then you can see us opening up, which is pretty cool. It's got that expansion thing. I thought actually once I started to see what I, see these items, once they're fully open, I decided I kind of liked a little bit of a gap here between them, so you could kind of see some sky between them. So what I did, I just moved those items while I was sitting here. So 2, I moved slightly off to the left so that there's a little gap here. And then 3, I moved a little bit the other direction so that there's a little bit of gap here. So we could add more by moving 2. I'm holding down shift as I do it. 3, shift as I do it. So now I'm seeing kind of, and you could mess around with that beforehand or afterwards. Let's work with it as it is, but that's a thing you can kind of tinker with. You'll want to do that you could do it here by hitting Control T, but you really should be doing it in stop time. That's your best bet. Okay, so this thing opens, but it doesn't really close. So one way we could make it close would be to just clone out these keyframes and then put another interpolation between these. I just multi-selected and then held down Alt and then dragged to the side to just get another keyframe of those things back at 0. But what we have available to us is the idea, since we want to make this go back and forth, we can do the equivalent of getting back to this value by looking at this, clicking on this key track, and there's a value on this key track right here where we have this loop padding, and we can set that to 2, and all of a sudden it figures out that it will use a smooth interpolation, and this red indicator is the indicator of the restarting, and then you can see it kind of pushing on kind of into infinity. And I can do the same one for this one. Loop padding, I'm going to set to 2. And you can see that the looping the looping will go on into infinity. You see these sort of light gray ghost keyframes. Okay, so we're cruising along. We now have this. I've exited the unit. We've got this unit that has this awesome little timeline packaged with it. And what we need is to... this thing is not really centered in its unit, is it? Let's take a look at that. Yeah, the unit center... Let's take the thing that's called number 1. I'm not sure why my items are all the way out here and my unit is based back there, but I do want my items to be centered on my unit. So this is a good lesson. What I have is now, since 1 is the parent of 2 and 3, and kind of the unit is essentially, you can think of as the parent container in a way for all of these objects. I need to get number 1 to be at the center of unit. And I kind of actually want... it won't really matter, but I kind of want the end of this item to be at the center. So what I can do is just transform. I can zero out the positions to get this of my number 1 to get it back over there where my unit is based. So there we go. So my unit is now good. Okay, so what I want to do is clone. I'm going to do, we could do 8 or whatever. We can do 5. And you could get super accurate with this. I'm just going to eyeball it. Another way, if you wanted a guide, is you could go to entities, go to sphere. Sorry, not sphere. Go to cylinder. You could do something like this using the scroll wheel, or coming up to subdivisions. You go to 5. Give yourself a guide. Or you could do a little bit of math. Never hurt anyone. So now we have these 4 objects. I was doing this all in pause time. I was moving all these objects around, so I'm going to select them all and hit Control T. I'll commit the transform so they'll stay here. And so now they've got this. I've got this kind of star item. I could actually, now that I'm here, I can just control holding Alt and rotate. I can get it, kind of go all the way to, and kind of make a 10-sided star here. Super eyeballing it. Anyway, good enough. And now we've got this kind of spidering item, but we want to combine it into one object. So what I'll do is select all these items, and then I can then I hit Control E, which creates a group, or I can just create a new group right here, and then drag all these items into the group. What I want to do, let me undo that. I'm going to do the Control E method. I'm going to hit Control E. I think it's a better method because it puts the center of the group at the center of all the items geometrically. And we can now rotate the item off of its pivot nicely. And now I can move them all around with one item, and kind of rotate it. Bring it over here into the light. Okay, so we've got this group. Now we need to emit this group. This group that's made, it's this compound of animated units and timelines. And I'm looking at this, and I kind of want this thing to like flex backwards, like over articulate, instead of just go to flat, like the way fingers would over articulate. But that's a little aesthetic realization I have now. Crank up the light a bit more. So what we need to do is emit these items, and we will scale them based on the velocity. So what we're going to do is take an emitter and get a node emitter, stick it in the space, and then that node emitter, its sample, we're going to hit pick, and we're going to pick the group. And now our node emitter is sitting here emitting spiders. And which is cool. What I want to do though is not emit on a continuous pulse of 1 per second. So I'm going to make the continuous pulse. I'm going to hit none there. And what I'm going to instead do is emit on moving. And I'm going to emit I'm going to emit 2 of these every meter. And see what that does. That's a lot. That's a lot. Because this is a pretty big object, and I'm moving a lot in the per meter, but something kind of awesome still. Maybe this is cool. Maybe we like this chaos. Catch this from an angle on the side. You see that once we get it to about here, we start getting into this place where we can really tinker around with the look. We can add kind of color to the light. So let's take a look at making this node emitter emit fewer per. Let's just do 1. Cool. So now what I want to do is put this node emitter on a grip. Which is a live tool. It's an add grip, which means that it has the interaction grabbable on it, which means that when I put a VR rig in the space, I can grab this with a laser. And I'll add grips. I'm going to use live tools. I'm going to add grips to these lights as well, so I can tinker with it. I'm going to take the sample one out of the way of the lights, just so it's kind of not in the primary space here. I'm going to hit G just so I'm like a little more oriented without the terrain. And what I want to do is set up the code here on this one. So this is the grip that's got our emitter in it. So I'm going to go to emitter grip is to name that. And then the code here is going to be on the node emitter itself, and it's going to be the on emit code. So what we're going to do is change the scale based on the velocity. See this? There's a rigid body that is fixed. Our grip our emitter's grip has a rigid body and it's movable false. But that means that it's going to stay in space, but it's going to have velocity as I move it. So if I can sample that velocity from the node emitter, and then I can scale the object that I'm going to emit, which is going to be this thing. So let's do exactly that. So node emitter, I'm going to scroll all the way down. I'm going to come to the events. I'm going to go to on emit, and in on emit, I am going to get my parent, so self get parent node. What is that? That's the grip. That's this. I'm going to get its rigid body, capital R, capital B. I'm going to get colon, get linear velocity, open close parenthesis, colon, and then get the length of that linear velocity. This is a three-dimensional vector with 3 components. I just want the magnitude of that, which is the overall velocity. And I want to set some variable equal to this, which I'm going to call amount. And that equals, that's going to make, we're going to scale this object, obj, the item that we're emitting. So obj colon set world scale, open close parentheses. Inside that parentheses, we need to give it a vector 3. So object set world scale vector 3. And then this is where we're going to go amount, comma, amount, comma, amount. So in the x direction, we're going to scale it equally based on this amount value. But we need to kind of know, is it too much? Is the value scaling enough? Yeah, you can see that it's making them pretty huge right off the bat. So we need to take that amount value and scale it way down. So right-click on node emitter, hit to edit code, and we're just going to say the amount is all of this, and we'll say it's times 0.01. So that's like 1/100th of that value. And let's go test this in VR. So what I'm going to do is click on VR, go put the preset rig in. I'll place it here. Just want to make sure I'm aiming in the direction. I don't need, I can always fly around to get where I want. I want to be sort of near this emitter grip. So I'll be up in the air. Bring them down a little bit. And turn on my controllers. Hit VR here. And I'll go ahead and give you guys a monoscopic view by going Edit, Preferences, Outputs. On the HMD camera display, I want to render out a screen into a new output known as the type of a screen display output, which will place it on the center, as it said, which is here, which means that you'll now see stereoscopic. You'll see monoscopic instead of stereoscopic. I immediately just sort of love the world that cloud world here. This is cool. I like it. I want more specularity on my things, and I want more of them per unit meter. So when they were huge, they stacked up quite a bit, and I was covering a big range. But I think I'm going to actually put 4 per meter will get emitted when I move. And I think the size was working well, but what I wanted to do was I'll change that material. See if I can get more specularity. Let's take a look at the movement though. Kind of cool. I don't like that specularity. there you go. You could make it very easy to switch out which object you want to sample into your item, or you could make multiple. You could also change, you could emit these things at all different sizes. These things actually small is super amazing. Like, we try to make things super big in VR, but like sometimes the like small stuff is like really tantalizing, especially as these things get to spider size. I feel like they hit you in a different primal way all of a sudden. Yeah, a lot to play with here. Just wanted to share this because I really enjoy what it looks like to create a bunch of this, really work with these little systems in a way. And hope this stimulates your imagination, and enjoy. More to come. Feel free to ask us questions on Discord at any time. Enjoy. Bye.